For people living with autism, Temple Grandin is a hero. But her story goes way before that, and Temple has proven that autism can be turned into a gift, not a disability. Now, if her name doesn't ring a bell, this might.
I have several ideas about how to make a new facility that'll be much more humane and efficient.
That's Claire Danes as Temple in an HBO film about her life. It's an incredible story.
Hey, now I got his attention. Now he's looking at me.
Temple did not speak till she was nearly 4 years old. Her father wanted to institutionalize her, but her mother refused, fighting to get Temple intense speech therapy, psychotherapy, and enrolling her in private schools who would work with Temple's special needs. Now, growing up, Temple would help out at her aunt's cattle ranch when she realized she had a special gift. She could think like a cow. She knew what made them scared. It was almost as if she could look through their eyes and figure out what made them feel safe. And like animals, Temple relied on visual cues to navigate her world. That made Temple rethink how livestock are handled in the beef and pork industry. Eventually, she got her PhD in animal sciences and went on to design innovative ways to make the livestock business more humane. Today, half the cattle in the US and Canada are handled in equipment that Temple designed. And companies like McDonald's and Burger King follow her guidelines on how to treat cattle. She's a professor at Colorado State University. She's written 9 books. And in 2010, Time magazine named her one of the 100 most influential people in the world.
All right, everybody, really happy to have this next guest. Please welcome Temple Grandin. Nice to see you, Temple.
Great to be here.
Likewise, great to have you. Welcome to the program. How have you been?
Been just fine.
Nice. Okay, there's a whole bunch of ground I want to cover. So just because you had such a really interesting and articulate way of dealing with this and talking about it, define and describe what autism is.
I mean, autism is a neurological disorder where there's differences in the development of the brain. It ranges all the way from a child that's going to remain nonverbal for the rest of his life, with a lot of handicaps, up to geniuses, you know, out Silicon Valley that do computer things, Tesla, who invented the power plant. In a lot of school systems today, Einstein would be diagnosed with some kind of autism problem, no speech until age 3. You know, a little bit of the autism trait, you might get a genius, he's not very social. Yeah. You know, if you've seen that Social Network movie, that's a very good example of Asperger's, which is mild autism.
You think that Mark Zuckerberg is that?
If that movie shows him accurately, I also read the book, if it shows him accurately, it is. And one of the things about being an autistic person, you got to learn social rules by being taught. And the thing is, you always keep growing. And I hope that Mr. Zuckerberg gets good advice on how to invest his money into socially good things. I was very pleased to find out about the donation he did to the school.
Yeah. It's interesting you say that you have to learn social things by being taught.
You have to learn that.
How old were you when you started to realize that you had to learn this?
Well, you see, in the 50s, social rules were pounded into kids. And I'm seeing a lot of kids on the mild end of the spectrum today having more problems today than not getting jobs. You know, because in the 50s, they'd pounded things into you, like saying please and thank you. You don't push in line. You know, learn how to take turns. You got to be a good sport. You know, today we got TV shows teaching people that, you know, you kick the weak off the show. Yeah. You don't work on helping the weak.
That's so, yeah, you're absolutely right. Well, what do you think?
I absolutely despise those shows because they teach the wrong values.
But they're so fascinating to people. Why do you think that is?
Well, I don't watch them. I think they're just horrid, and I've only watched them enough to learn about them. I absolutely hate them, because what happened to the values of helping the weak? I mean, I grew up in an era where Roy Rogers rules for living, and you look them up on the internet, and they're good rules. Things like you protect the weak, you know, you're polite, you're neat and clean, you're kind to animals. Those are part of Roy Rogers rules for living.
Yeah, well, the animals one you certainly took to heart, didn't you?
Well, I've been working with improving, you know, handling of animals for a long time. Because one thing I'm interested in is we've got to work on doing things to make real improvements on the ground. I'm seeing too many of these smart kids not having their abilities developed. Because one of the things about a mind on the autism spectrum is it tends to be good at one thing and really bad at something else. Someone like me is really good at visual thinking, and art was my best subject in school, but I couldn't figure out how to do algebra. And another thing I think is really hurting a lot in education today is so many schools have taken the hands-on things out of the classroom. We've got to start figuring out when kids are like 13, 14 years old, what are they going to do when they grow up? I mean, my ability in art was always encouraged. And I was taught work skills really young.
Who taught you those?
Well, my mother had me doing a sewing job when I was 13 years old, doing freelance sewing for seamstress out of her house.
When are your earliest memories? Like, how old were you when you started to...
I can remember a few things back to age 3 in nursery school, marching around with flags. I can remember my teacher had this pointer, and I was scared to death of it. And she pointed at me, and my nanny had taught me never to point things at people. So that scared me. And I had very good early intervention. By the time I was 2 1/2, I was in a very good speech therapy program, very much like a lot of the ABA programs today. When I was 3, my mother hired a nanny that taught constant turn taking. You got to teach these kids to take turns. And the thing is that the things back in the 50s that were fun involved taking turns. You played board games. Yeah. You didn't play video games by yourself. You got to learn how to take turns in a board game.
And that was important to your development?
Absolutely. Learning how to take turns is extremely important.
Right.
You know, and then things like being on time. When I was like 7, I got an alarm clock, and I was expected to wind it. It was the kind you had to wind, and I expected to set it and to get up in the morning.
For people who, you know, who know a kid with autism, there's this, and you hear about the way they're described, that you can't reach them. But from the inside, when you know, some people can't speak, or what are you seeing? Well,
when I was a little kid, you see, there's different kinds of speech problems you can get. When grown-ups talk really fast, it went into gibberish because the processing speed of my brain is slower. But when they spoke slowly to me, I understood. And I had problems getting my words out. And then some of the kids that remain nonverbal, they're just hearing gibberish because the hard consonant sounds are dropping out. Even though the auditory threshold shows that they're not deaf, if I said, the dog walked down the street, they might be hearing the eat. They might be just hearing the vowel sounds. And if you imagine the brain as a big office tower, okay, up at the top you got the president, that's the frontal cortex, and there's a lot of circuits there that are missing. Division vice president level, that's language. Underneath that you got good geek stuff, art, math, music, all the fun stuff. There may be extra connections there, but there's not enough connections maybe to the language department. Some connections are missing, or connections are missing going up to the president's office, and it's variable. Autism is extremely variable.
When was the first time you felt understood?
Well, people are always looking for magical turning points. There is no magic turning point. You see, since I'm a bottom-up thinker, I got to take lots of specific examples and fill up the internet that's inside my head so that Google that I got in my head has stuff to search. And so you just keep learning more and more and more and more. There is no magic turning point.
What do you think about the role medication is playing?
I would not be here today without medication. I had terrible anxiety. It was like, oh, looking around for danger, like this room's full of snakes, maybe one's going to come out from underneath this chair. You know, always looking for danger all the time. But I take a very low dose, and the principle of antidepressants is take a much lower dose than what's normally used for depression. That's explained in detail in Thinking in Pictures. And if you follow that, it will work. But on the other hand, there's way too many powerful drugs given out to little kids like candy. They're getting kids loaded up on Risperdal and other very powerful drugs, and you're going to just make a zombie out of them that isn't going to be able to think. There's a place for medication, used conservatively and carefully. But there's a lot of kids that are giving out powerful drugs because he can't concentrate. And I said to the mom, what is he eating for breakfast? Well, he's eating like Cocoa Puffs for breakfast. Well, then you wonder why he's all hungry at 11 o'clock. I said, why don't you give him some eggs and scrambled eggs and an apple for breakfast and more exercise. Let's try that first before you do medication. A decent breakfast and more exercise. I'm
sure you meet lots of parents with kids with autism, and you probably have lots of conversations with kids with autism.
Yes,
what are those conversations like?
Well, I'm seeing more problems today with real smart kids on the spectrum going nowhere. And part of the reason is they haven't been pushed enough to do things. You know, I was reluctant to learn to drive, and Ann got me in the old pickup truck, and she taught me how to drive. We're out on her ranch out in the country where there's nothing to hit. And every day we drove 3 miles to the mailbox, and I had to drive a very balky pickup truck with a 3 on the column with a terrible clutch. Now, I want to emphasize that you might need a year on easy roads first, but you need to practice every day on those easy roads.
There's a lot of people who are not on the autism spectrum. They need a lot more time on the easy roads, too.
Well,
so it's for everybody, right?
That's right. And you just, and originally I didn't want to go out to my aunt's ranch because I was scared. And Mother said, it's a week or 2 or all summer. So give me a choice. But not going wasn't one of the choices. Right. You got to push these kids some to get them to do things. She'd get me jobs. When I was in college, she got me set up for an internship at a research lab.
watching the movie and reading about your life and hearing you speak, and I hear about your mother who, for all intents and purposes, didn't have any education to teach her that this is how she should work with you, but she seemed to figure out.
She figured it out, and some of it was also the era. You know, there was all that bad stuff going on where parents were blamed, you know, for causing autism. That garbage happened in the 60s.
Right.
You see, for the first 10 years, my mother wasn't subjected to that stuff.
When I ask you about your father, what do you think of?
Well, he was a real estate agent, not all that good, behaviorally awkward. Yeah. And he had some social problems. You'd go to a restaurant and the oysters would be too small, he'd blow a big temper tantrum. And
when you hear back about your family and the conversations that your mother and your father had in your growing up, how aware were you of what was going on?
Well, my father, you know, there were a lot of people later on that thought, you know, autistic kid, just put him in an institution. But one of the things that kept Mother going was she could see that I was improving.
So you said at that time people were talking about putting kids...
Well, they did just put them in an institution.
Your father was one of them? Is that what you're saying?
Well, there were other doctors that said I'd be in an institution. My father, you know, he was one of the ones that had to be, you know, Mother had to fight him off.
Yeah. And then you get to the ranch and you meet, and you have a science teacher.
Well, the ranch stuff, you see, the science teacher was when I was in high school. And I got...
The science teacher played a big role.
Oh, yes, because when I was 14, I got kicked out of a large girls' school for throwing a book at a girl who teased me. Mm-hmm. And then I went to special boarding school for emotionally disturbed kids, because you got to remember, this is 60s, so everything was emotional disturbance. And I didn't study, but I did lots of work. Mm-hmm. I took care of 9 horses, cleaned their stalls every day. I redid our ski tail house. I made scenery for the school play. I learned how to do things that other people wanted. And then my science teacher came along, Mr. Carlock, and he got an honorary doctorate for the movie, and he got me interested in science, because now I had a reason to study, to become a scientist. So I really turned around and I started studying.
How did you get connected to animals? I mean, you seem to...
Well, when I was in high school, we had horses there. I loved riding and horses. Oh, I was like absolute horse nut. And then when I went out to Arizona, my aunt's ranch, I watched cattle going in the squeeze chute, and the cattle we put in a squeeze chute to get their vaccinations. And that's shown in the movie. And it's a metal stall, and it kind of squeezes them up each side. And I noticed that some of the cattle just kind of relaxed. So I went and tried out the squeeze chute, and it calmed down my nerves. You see, there's a number of kids on the autism spectrum that will seek deep pressure on wide areas of their body, and it will calm them down. And of course I got fixated on the squeeze chute, so then I had to go to every feed yard in Arizona to learn about squeeze chutes, and then it helped get the interest in cattle going. You know, this brings up another thing. You take the fixation and you broaden it out. You know, I had to learn a lot of other things about cattle handling, about design of facilities. You know, half of the cattle in North America, including half the cattle here in Canada, are handled in a piece of equipment I designed called a center track restrainer system.
How does that make you feel?
That makes me feel really good.
Yeah. It's like it... Was there ever any part of you that wanted to prove that you could do this?
There was definitely a part of me in my early 20s where I wanted to prove to people I wasn't stupid.
Right.
That was a very big thing.
Did people call you stupid? Like, how did they...
Well, a lot of people thought I was a stupid retard that couldn't do anything. And when that dip vat got built and they said it was a masterpiece, and that did happen, and the thing with a metal plate put in there, that
all things that you designed and arranged, right?
Everything, all the design stuff was accurate. Now, the movie showed them wrecking my dip vat, putting a metal plate in there. That was taken out and fixed. Mm-hmm. And I went on to build a whole bunch more of those, and that's how my design business got started.
More with Temple. We'll be right back. Back here on the program, we're hanging out with Temple Grandin. You were bullied as a kid. How did you cope with it?
Well, when I first got bullied, I coped it with fists and throwing things. And then after I got horseback riding taken away from me, I somehow switched emotions, and I went from anger to crying because I still wanted to ride those horses. And if I hadn't learned how to cry when I got bullied, I wouldn't have had any career. Because there were a lot of times when I had social problems at these meat plants, too, and I'd go underneath the basement stairs or out on the cattle catwalk and cry. Because if I'd hit somebody, I would have been kicked out of the plants, and that would have been that.
And an emotion is the same for somebody dealing with autism.
Well,
just
you have emotions. I got emotions. And one of the problems, since you're missing some circuits in the frontal cortex, is controlling them. Yeah. You lose some of that top-down control. And yes, being teasing hurt, and it hurt a whole lot. Now, my emotions are more in the present. If somebody can stop bullying me and start being nice, I don't hold a grudge quite the same way. You know how a dog can growl 1 minute and wag its tail the next minute? Yeah. That's sort of more like how my emotions are. All right, I definitely have them.
What's interesting about it is that you seem to understand these animals. There's a scene where you actually get on your knees and see how animals think and feel. I was doing that in the 70s. But there's a part of this then where what you've done is created this really interesting place where ultimately animals go to die.
Well, you know, I've done a lot of thinking about the dying, and I can remember designing one of my really big systems, you know, a few years later, and I thought, you know, the cattle would never be born if we hadn't bred them. They would have never have existed at all. And the thing is, nature can be really harsh and cruel. You know, it says in the movies, nature's cruel, but we don't have to be. I mean, there's nothing nice about how a wolf deguts a deer before he eats it. Right. The cats, at least, will kill it first. Yeah. Wolves will degut it and eat it while it's alive. There's nothing nice about that. I mean, everything dies eventually. Right. But we owe it to the animals to give them a really good life. Beef cattle, of all the farm animals, have the best life. They live in the most extensive environment. Pigs and laying hens, they have some of the most problems, and we're going to need to correct some of those problems. And one of the problems I'm concerned about is we're pushing these animals to grow faster and faster and faster, and if you're not careful, you can get problems with lameness and hyperexcitability. No, that's not all right. We owe animals a decent life. When I eat meat, I got no intention of giving it up. In fact, I can't even function if I don't eat meat. Right. I get hypoglycemic and can't function.
So why is it important to you then for animal welfare to be like this for you? Like, why is that important?
Animals feel pain. Animals have emotion. In fact, I just recently reviewed the literature on animal emotion, and I talk about that in my book, Animals Make Us Human. And the emotional systems in the subcortex of the brain are the same in all mammals. The difference between a dog's emotion or cow's emotions and people is the complexity of it. People filter the emotion through a huge, gigantic cerebral cortex, which makes it a lot more complex.
What do you think of vegetarians?
Well, everybody has their own, you know, ethical things, and you also get into, well, do you want to reform the meat industry or get rid of it? Right. I mean, there are some advocates that want to get rid of the meat industry. I want to fix the meat industry, not get rid of it. And there are things that need to be fixed.
For sure.
And in the 80s, the meat industry was awful, absolutely awful. And in Canada, actually, during that time, it was better than the U.S. And then in 1999, when McDonald's started their audits down in the U.S., then the U.S. pulled ahead of Canada. And that shows the power of what a large customer can do. And I developed a very simple scoring system. So you don't go into a plant and say, well, you're doing something properly or not. You go in a plant and you count how many cattle are mooing and bellering. And if more than 3 cattle out of 100 moo and beller going into the stunning area, they fail the audit. If more than one animal out of 100 falls down, they fail the audit.
What's the biggest life lesson you learned as an adult?
Well, that's a difficult thing to say. And, you know, you wonder, what is the meaning of life? And when I was younger, I was looking for all kinds of complicated things. Now, if the things that I do make a real difference, you see, I'm not into ideology and theory. You see, ideology and theory doesn't mean much to me, because I'm an absolute non-abstract thinker, because I think in photorealistic pictures. You know, mom writes to me and says, my kid went to college because of your book. That makes me happy. Or a rancher calls me up and says, well, we built one of your corral systems and it works really well. Or I developed an auditing system for scoring animal handling at meat plants. McDonald's implemented that 10 years ago. I worked on implementing that, and I saw a lot of improvements in the slaughterhouses. That's something real. You know, one of the big problems we got today, especially all the mess in the U.S. with politics right now, is things have gotten too far away from reality. I call it abstractification. They're making policy and having to think about, well, how's this going to work on the ground?
So we're saying more people on the autism spectrum should be in politics.
Well, we need to be figuring out how to solve practical problems. You know, in the 50s, in my country, the Republicans built the interstate highway system and the Democrats went to the moon in the 60s. You know, what are they doing now? Fighting and throwing each other out of office, and nothing's getting accomplished.
Absolutely. Stick around. We're actually going to show you how Temple thinks in pictures. More with Temple Grandin right after this. Thank you. On the program with Temple Grandin. I want to, like, you've once described your brain as kind of like Google Images. Is that what your brain is like?
That's right.
So we can just Google
Except
you?
they come up sequentially, just
Okay.
like it shows in the movie.
That makes sense. But I have some other questions. What's your favorite sound?
Favorite sound? Oh, well, I'm now starting to see pictures. I'm now hearing the Phantom of the Opera, and I'm seeing the Phantom of the Opera.
Oh, nice.
Because that was a show that I really, really liked.
Like the big part, the dun, 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 dun.
Da-da-da-da, yeah.
Nice. I'm going to give you a Pink Floyd album, okay? Because there's a song that I think they took that from. So I'm going to give you a Pink Floyd album. I think you're going to love that, all right?
Okay.
If you like that. If you could be an animal for a day, which one would you be?
Well, cattle out on really nice pastures.
But nowhere near your machinery, right?
No, I want to live for a while. And the cattle that were used in the HBO movie were bought for the HBO movie, and they were heifers, heifer calves, and they're mama cows out on a ranch, and they have calves.
Describe your life in one word.
Well, that's a difficult thing to do. I now just saw images of Life magazine, an old magazine we had down in the States. And when I was a young kid, my mother wanted to give a Life Begins at 40 party for one of her best friends, and I had to go around the neighborhood and collect 40 Life magazines. So that's the thing that came into my mind when you said that.
Because you're a very visual thinker, is there a particular photograph that you own that's your favorite?
I have a picture of Einstein I really like. You know, it says, talks about, he talks about, you know, being kind and things like that.
How about if I say origami?
Origami, I'm seeing some beautiful origami that's on my little bay window shelf that a young man that's very mathematical gave me.
Nice.
And that's the first thing I saw, and it said origami. I'm also seeing a slide I show on my slideshow of some origami done by Robert Lang of a praying mantis with a very, very complicated folding pattern. Again, I am seeing specific examples of origami. I'm also seeing some origami I made out of newspaper on an airplane to entertain a kid one time.
Nice, okay, that's nice. Let me throw another word at you. Gravity.
Gravity. I'm seeing a picture of Newton dropping an apple. I'm seeing artificial gravity, like when I was a kid. I loved this rotor thing that would like spin you around, stick you up against the wall.
I love that thing.
That's artificial gravity.
The Gravitron, it's amazing.
The Gravitron is made in Colorado.
Yeah, nice.
The Gravitron is. Then, and that's better than the rotor. The Gravitron's better than the rotor. Then I'm seeing the space station in 2001, an Odyssey, you know, that's spinning. And it has the Howard Johnson's restaurant in it.
It's good to see you. Thanks for.
So I'm kind of seeing examples of, you know, gravity.
Nice to see you. Thanks for coming.
Okay, great. Thanks for
I
having me.
appreciate it. Temple Grandin, everybody. Strongbow.com is the website. We'll see you next Friday. Really happy to have this next guest. Please welcome Temple Grandin. Nice to see you, Temple.
Great to be here.
Likewise. Great to have you. Welcome to the program. How have you been?
Been just fine.
Nice. Okay, there's a whole bunch of ground I want to cover. So because you had such a really interesting and articulate way of dealing with this and talking about it, define and describe what autism is.
I mean, autism is a neurological disorder where there's differences in the development of the brain. It ranges all the way from a child that's going to remain nonverbal for the rest of his life, with a lot of handicaps, up to geniuses, you know, out in Silicon Valley that do computer things, Tesla, who invented the power plant. In a lot of school systems today, Einstein would be diagnosed with some kind of autism problem, no speech until age 3. You know, a little bit of the autism trait, you might get a genius, he's not very social. Yeah. You know, if you've seen that Social Network movie, that's a very good example of Asperger's, which is mild autism.
You think that Mark Zuckerberg is that?
If that movie...
To institutionalize her, but her mother refused, fighting to get Temple intense speech therapy, psychotherapy, and enrolling her in private schools who would work with Temple's special needs. Now, growing up, Temple would help out at her aunt's cattle ranch when she realized she had a special gift. She could think like a cow. She knew what made them scared. It was almost as if she could look through their eyes and figure out what made them feel safe. And like animals, Temple relied on visual cues to navigate her world. That made Temple rethink how livestock are handled in the beef. For people living with autism, Temple Grandin is a hero. But her story goes way before that, and Temple has proven that autism can be turned into a gift, not a disability. Now, if her name doesn't ring a bell, this might.
I have several ideas about how to make a new facility that'll be much more humane and efficient.
That's Claire Danes as Temple in an HBO film about her life. It's an incredible story.
Hey, now I got his attention. Now he's looking at me.
Temple did not speak till she was nearly 4 years old. Her father wanted in pork industry. Eventually, she got her PhD in animal sciences and went on to design innovative ways to make the livestock business more humane. Today, half the cattle in the US and Canada are handled in equipment that Temple designed. And companies like McDonald's and Burger King follow her guidelines on how to treat cattle. She's a professor at Colorado State University. She's written 9 books. And in 2010, Time magazine named her one of the 100 most influential people in the world.
All right, everybody.